Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm doing a video of 5 dungeon crawlers facing off against one another. But not just dungeon crawlers, campaign dungeon crawlers that will give you an absolute ton of content, although probably the least so in terms of Massive Darkness, not the amount of content, but rather the nature of the camp. We're going to get to it. We're going to talk about all of it, but what I will say is the following. This is going to be a pro-con list. I'm going to try to keep this video short. It's not going to be an hour-long play, this, not that. It's going to be giving you the highs and lows of each of these 5, as well as my personal rankings of which order I choose them in and why. I'm going to be going through these fairly quickly. I will say one of the cons on all of these, because they all have pros, they all have cons, but to save you all the time, the con on every single one of these is the price point. These are all expensive and hard to get, and or both. Expensive or hard to get, and or both. We have Frosthaven that goes for like $300 for the game. That's an insane price point, but I mean, it's a big box of game with hundreds of hours of content, so there is that, although they all have hundreds of hours of content. We have Isofarian Guard, which once upon a time was a $79 game, but now is much, much more than that because it was massively underpriced for what it was. Good luck getting on your hands on it now. I'm assuming they'll have a reprint campaign at some point, and when they do, this is something that you can try to get your hands on. If they do, not when they do, if they do, but it's been really well received, so I imagine they will. Then we have Tanares Adventures, which is incredibly hard to get your hands on as well. They also are having a reprint campaign. I say also as if this is happening. They are definitely having a reprint campaign. They already announced the date, I believe late June for it, and Tanares Adventures otherwise a hard to get your hands on game, including the fact that you'll need the base game. Currently, you need the Arena of the Contest base game to get your hands on this. So again, just adding to the price point. You can't just get Tanares Adventures, you have to get Arena of the Contest. I don't know if that will hold true, or if they'll release some sort of pack where you don't need that, but that's currently the case with the game. We have Oathsworn, again an incredibly hard to get game, which I don't know if the Pledge Manager is still open. They already had their reprint campaign, and the Pledge Manager may or may not be open, but you can definitely get your hands on that some way, shape, or form. It's just a question of how much you're willing to pay on the secondhand market, and or are you willing to pledge and wait for the next campaign, and even so, all of these so far are going to be hundreds of dollars. And then Massive Darkness, arguably the cheapest if you're just looking for the base game, and cheapest is a relative term, coming in at around $90, $80 for a retail copy of the game. That's not the cheapest. Well, it is the cheapest. It's not cheap. I'll also say, though, that I'm talking about Massive Darkness today specifically more than just the base game. These are all campaign games, and I am talking about the Massive Darkness campaign, not just the fact that it has a single shot mode. It has a progression, scenario-based mode you can go through, but it also has a campaign with a degree of progression and longevity and maintenance, whatever you want to call it, legacy elements throughout the campaign, saving your upgrade and progress throughout the 9-game adventure? I have to double check. You go on a branching pathway. I can't remember the exact count of how many there are. Maybe 8. I don't remember exactly how many there are. But yes, the cons on all of these are they are expensive. But with that, let's go through these, and this will not be a very in-depth conversation around each of them, around how they play, all of that. We'll give you a brief overview of how they play, but we're going to talk about each of those, and let's start with Isofarian Guard. Isofarian Guard is a giant game. It's a giant bag building game in which every single session every single campaign out of the 5 campaign arcs they have, you're going to be controlling 2 characters. You can do it solo or 2-player, controlling 2 characters as you choose their skills, work with those 2 characters, and then you go to the next campaign where you control the next 2, the next 2, the next 2, until you get to the final campaign, which is a bit different. Between the 5 campaigns, you're talking about hundreds of hours of content. Each campaign on its own is somewhere between 40 to 70 hours of content, depending on how much side quests, how fast you go through it, and all of that. And it's very much a bag building system as you build out your character's bag, but each character has a completely unique way that they level up, that they add special chips to their bag, the way they operate, the cards they have. There's a ton of uniqueness to the way each character feels. There's going to be a giant world map that you're exploring with a sense of missions and accomplishment, and it's also accompanied by a huge foreteller app with foreteller audio and immersion and music, not just audio, but full-on immersion, music, everything. And that's going to bring us to the pros over here, because the pros are from all these campaigns on the table. And I'll also say, before I dive into this, I like all of these 5 games. These are all amazing experiences that I highly recommend, but I will talk about my pros and cons of each. Starting with the first pro of Isofarian Guard, which has the most immersive story. Not necessarily the best story, that might go to Oathsworn over here, but in terms of the most immersive story, I think Isofarian Guard pulls me in the most. I'd say it's roughly comparable to Oathsworn in terms of the quality, possibly a drop less, a little bit more cheesy, maybe. I don't know, I like it. I like the story, it works overall. And it could be just the acting, the voice acting could make it a drop almost cheesier in nature, but it's not really cheesy, it's immersive. If you put on the audio, you can actually watch a playthrough of me going through it, but this is one of the few games where I actually use the audio and just sit back for 10 minutes to listen to a cutscene. I don't do that in video games, I don't do that in board games, I do it for the Isofarian Guard because it's that good. It has the most immersive story on the table. It also has arguably the most content from any game on the table, and yes, Frosthaven is right on top of it, and I think Isofarian Guard has more content than that. The sheer scope of this world, the sheer amount of world building that there is and exploration across this 5 campaign arc, there's an absolute ton of gameplay, more so than you will ever possibly be able to reasonably go into. If you're going on these missions, I don't recommend going on every single last side quest. Pick the ones that appeal to you, but then move on, because this is a giant, incredible world with, again, hundreds of hours of content. I'll also say that it has incredibly satisfying combo building. Some of the arguably the most satisfying combo building in the game. Many of these games are going to have larger or different degrees of working together. They all involve working together in different ways at different points. But while I will say that Tanares is going to have one of the higher degrees of combo building, I think Isofarian Guard beats it. The way you have the characters working together, and part of it, by the way, part of it is the strength of the characters. The fact that they have 2 characters. You don't get a choice of characters, so they didn't have to build a system that works around whichever one of 15 characters you pick and put together. They have these 2 characters together, these 2 characters together, these 2 are together, and that combinations gives them the freedom to build things that really work well. To give you 2 characters that have their own different arcs of the way you build them out, the way you develop their cards, the way you build out their bag of chips, and then the way you work together to take down the enemies. It has some incredibly satisfying combo building as you reach into your bag, grab the next best stack of chips, and hope that you win the next combat. As far as the con side, the first thing I'll say is that the combat cycling can be a bit repetitive in the game. This is one of those things where it will depend on how you approach it, and it will depend on how much you mix things up and how often you add new cards to your deck, or even when you don't just add a card, when you go back to a previously existing card and mix it in just for the sake of trying a new build. There are ways to break that repetitiveness, but it has some of the most repetitive gameplay in terms of you'll go on a mission, you'll draw the same sequence of chips, you'll do that really exciting combo, but then, 7 fights in a row later, an hour and a half of play in, you're like, you know what, I just had the exact same sequence of how it was incredibly satisfying, but it can be repetitive. The lack of a combat battlefield. Isofarian Guard is the only one of these 4 games on the table, 5 games on the table, that does not have some sort of grid that you're walking through on the board, some sort of actual board you're navigating. You have an overall world map that you're navigating, but then combats are abstracted to just simply lanes of combat. There's no movement on the board, and that means that some of the combos do limit just how far you can go, and they can become a bit repetitive. While they are the most satisfying, they are also arguably the most repetitive in the way you'll engage in combats again and again. Things will break things up, the types of enemies you have, the progression you have, there are things that break it up, but not necessarily as fast as they are coming at you, and so it can be a bit repetitive. I'll also say that the table space for this game is obnoxious, and none of these games are light on setup or light on table space, but I think Isofarian Guard is arguably the worst. The components are so ridiculously large, larger than they needed to be, and that includes a box that is obnoxious to take off my shelf. This is a hard box I have on the top of a 5x5 Calyx. Do you know how hard it is to pick a 37-pound box off the top of a Calyx when you have games on the other side? It is a lot of work to get this game down here, but it is worth it when you do. But the game is large and larger than it needs to be. It takes up a huge amount of play area, especially if you have the world map going on at the same time, especially if you're fighting off with 2 people against 4 enemies. There's just so much stuff on the table to manage. Frosthaven. Frosthaven is, well, it's the most crunchy of the games on the table. It has the most Euro flavor in terms of the least reliance on luck. There is luck in the game, there's going to be modifier cards and things that happen, but it has the least reliance on luck on a table full of games that will rely on rolling dice, on lots and lots of luck. Again, arguably Oathsworn is the second most in that category. But Frosthaven has so much crunchiness to the way you build out your cards, the way you work with your deck. It's going to be built on the Gloomhaven system, obviously, with a lot of changes that Frosthaven brings to the table. And that system does work, and it became the #1 game for a long time for a reason. And it's because it's crunchy, it's meaty, and it's rewarding. There's tons of character depth in the game. I didn't even tell you what Frosthaven was like. I just went straight to the pros and cons because I kind of assume everyone knows what Frosthaven is. Frosthaven is a dungeon crawler. It's a dungeon crawler with hundreds of missions. I think 131 possible missions. You won't necessarily play through all of them, but you'll go through a lot of them. You'll have a degree of branching story path. Frosthaven in particular, compared to Gloomhaven, brings you this encampment phase in between missions where you can build up your settlement, you can build up the outpost, and you can go through that trying to build up buildings and level up different aspects and gather potions and find more items and all these different things you can do as you explore the world. You're going to be making choices as far as who to ally with across the course of the game, and the dungeon crawling experience is going to play out on a map that you build out each differently every single scenario. You have slight differences to the way scenarios' goals are structured, the enemies you're fighting off, and how the whole system works. And you're playing the top half of one card and the bottom bottom half of another card. The entire game, you have access to your whole hand of cards. You pick 2 cards to play, top half of one, bottom half of the other, and then those cards are gone. And when you draw your cards back, you have to get rid of a card, and that's going to be the timer on the game. So you're managing your health, but also your card economy as you go through the game, which is why I say that the first pro is that it's the most crunchy dungeon crawler on this table. It has such agency of choice as you go through it, with a degree of luck as you draw modifier cards into combat, but it has a ton of character depth. It has a ton of content. Again, second most, I want to say second most to... It's hard to judge things against. I'm going to say it's the second most content on the table behind Isofarian Guard, and there's riddles and base building and more enhanced play on top of the original Gloomhaven. All of these things keep you interesting. The riddles in Frosthaven are rewarding. They're a little challenge, logical puzzles to jump your way through. The outpost phase is going to mix things up in a way that gives you that sense of progression throughout the course of the journey, so you're not just going on quest after quest after quest, but you are enhancing something along the way, something permanent, stronger than the pure something level in Gloomhaven. There's a level, I can't remember the term for it, where the popularity of Gloomhaven, but there's a term for it, but I can't remember what it was. But either way, you're going to have that and more in Frosthaven as you build out the base and the outpost around you. Is the biggest con, I think, is just how tactically rewarding the combat is, because it is incredibly tactically rewarding. But as far as the cons go, the cons over here, they say the biggest con, the biggest pro is the combat. But as far as the cons go, the story can get lost in the gameplay. And I say that while acknowledging that Frosthaven's story is better than Gloomhaven. I have not done a full review on this yet. I will do at some point. But the story in Frosthaven is good. It's not good. It's not. The story in Frosthaven is better than it was in Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven, to me, and it was a forgettable story that I never cared at all what was happening across 100 missions of gameplay. I never once cared. There's this stuff in the background. There's a character here or there. They're doing things. I don't know why. The world around me has nothing to the world around me. Every single one... Well, no, Massive Darkness is also weak. If we ignore Massive Darkness, Oathsworn, Tanares, and Isofarian Guard invest me in the story to some degree. Massive Darkness doesn't, but also doesn't even pretend to. Versus Frosthaven, to me, almost pretends to, and Gloomhaven didn't do it at all. Frosthaven does it a bit, and it does it a bit by giving you choices of who to ally with and how to proceed, that give you larger branching paths with more obvious consequences that I slightly care. Gloomhaven I didn't care at all, Frosthaven I slightly care, but I still don't care enough. I still feel that the amount of missions, the progression the game has, doesn't seem to entrance you enough in the story elements of the gameplay. Are they there? Yes. May it work for you? Possibly, but it still doesn't work for me. Also, the setup time is the worst from every one of these 5 games, in my opinion. I'm sure this is a debatable thing. These are all have a lot of setup time, but I think Frosthaven, to me, is the worst game as far as the setup time, and then going to the next mission, and the next mission, and just moving your way forward. I could have it set up on the table, and then tearing it apart and going to the next mission is a chore and a process. Bringing it out from the shelf to begin with is a chore and a process, more so than any of these games, and again, they all suffer from that. I'll also say that Frosthaven, more than any of these other games, has the potential and the capacity to get stuck on a scenario that just feels brutally annoying, and your only real option is to just lower the difficulty level, or to just keep on grinding through it, neither of which is a particularly satisfying way to move forward. Because of how almost Euro-based this game is, because of how much this is about the card economy and how you do it, the game, to be balanced that well, the game has to be challenging to be rewarding, but it also means that you run the risk of a scenario being just a drop too challenging, that there was a way to approach it, or a set of characters that could have approached that would have had an easier time, and you don't have that combination, and so that particular scenario is just too much. Both Gloomhaven and Frosthaven have had multiple scenarios that I was like, okay, great, I'll play this 3 to 5 times until I eventually win, just to move on. And that's not, to me, a satisfying experience. As far as Massive Darkness is arguably the most odd one out on the table. For me, by the way, these are all specifically, the specific genre I'm going for here as I pick these out is all the newest dungeon crawlers that are currently arriving. Massive Darkness being the oldest one, so another sore thumb in that sense. But also just mechanically speaking, these are heavier, giant, overwhelming campaign narrative experiences. And then we have Massive Darkness, which is a one-shot game that happens to have a campaign mode. But also, I played it recently, and I'm really, really enjoying it, and so I wanted to talk about it and have it in this conversation, so we're going to do so. But Massive Darkness does have a campaign mode, which is why it's able to be on this table. Massive Darkness has 2 things. The first of all, the general idea of Massive Darkness is going to be a strongly asymmetric character, a dungeon crawling game of rolling handfuls of dice as you go through episode by episode by episode, not really campaign driven in and of itself. There's going to be lots of ways things level up as you're going through it, but ultimately it's designed as a one-shot experience. There's also a campaign mode in which you go through a semi-branching arc. It's not really full branching. It's going to be like, mission, then choose a few missions, then mission, then back to the center, then choose a few. You're going through a semi-branching arc where you have some degree degree of agency and choice as you go through it. Also, you're going to have a degree of fail forward if you know, well, not fail forward. If you fail a mission 3 times and you're done, the campaign's over, so you can reset. But it's also only like 8 or 9 missions total, so it's not overwhelming. It's the shortest campaign on the table, which is also why I wanted to include it. Because while it is a sore thumb in being different, that also means that if you're looking for something over here, if you're looking for the pros and cons of any particular game, this one stands out as possibly being better for you because of the fact that the very first pro is the fact that it has a strong one-shot mode. The other games, they don't have strong one-shot modes. Even when they have one-shot modes, they don't have strong one-shot modes. Massive Darkness is designed first and foremost as a one-shot, and even in the campaign mode is the shortest, most accessible of a campaign on the table, coming in at, what, 9 games? Oathsworn is going to be the second most comparable at 20 games, and Massive Darkness is nothing. I keep saying 9, it might be 8, I think it's 8. But either way, it's the shortest campaign on the table. The strong asymmetric classes are incredibly rewarding as well, although many of these games, in fact, all of these games have strong asymmetric classes, so I wouldn't necessarily give that much of a pro, but it is a strong pro, and just, it is the most engaging as far as just rolling giant handfuls of dice while you gather various loot, have powers and equipment, and powers and abilities, and equipment, and all these things as you level up against increasingly difficult enemies. Overall, it is the most accessible from all these games, in a way that makes it stand out, but in a way that if you're looking for one of these games, it might be the one that's right for you, specifically because of that. As far as the cons in Massive Darkness, first of all, the base game needs difficulty modification. Even the campaign to a small degree, although it depends to a certain degree on player count, more so at smaller player counts, but depending on player count, you might need more difficulty modification to try to make this a more challenging experience. It starts off a bit too easy, and while there are plenty of things online as far as ways to adjust the difficulty without that much work to make it a better experience, you still have to go through that house ruling legwork to find the difficulty that makes it a challenging experience for you, but also a rewarding experience which you can accomplish it. You have to play with that for your own group, your own player count, and it will vary by player count. The difficulty modifications I throw in at a 2-player game are different than what I throw in at a 4-player game, and character versus player game, and so that does change. You have to play around with stuff in a way that makes it feel like you're designing the ideal difficulty, which is like, I mean, why couldn't Command have done it for you? But they didn't. They designed it as a bit more accessible. I mean, there are people who have had a challenge even with the game as is, but if you're coming into it as a more seasoned gamer, you will likely, not guaranteed, but likely, depending on player count, depending on you, depending on your group, likely have to adjust the difficulties to a small degree. I'll also say that the enemies lack real distinction. There's a lot of enemies in Massive Darkness, more so if you have the expansions, more so if you have the original first edition as well. There's a lot of enemies. And they just don't feel that standout different. The enemies, by their very nature, the enemies are going to be a combination of an enemy and drawing a weapon card, which means off the bat, almost all enemies are ranged or melee depending on what card they draw, which just really takes away any flavor from the enemies. And then in addition to that, when you have bags and bags and bags of enemies, there's only so many ways you can modify their stats without just adding rule text abilities. And so the modification of stats means that they don't feel noticeably different. When I pull one bag of the enemies off the table or another, I don't really feel, okay, great, this one has 1 more armor, that one has, a bit more health, that one has rolls more defense dice. They just feel like small stat adjustments as opposed to a strong flavor. Now, there are occasional exceptions, but the basic enemies do not have any real distinction. The roaming mobs, yes. The bosses, yes. But the basic enemies, you have bags and bags and bags of them, and they don't feel meaningfully different. I'll also say that has the most linear campaign of the group here. Now, although that does depend, because Frosthaven has a large degree of branching choices, Isofarian has a ton of agency as far as how you progress through it. Oathsworn gives you agency in the story, but then the actual progression is incredibly linear, so you can argue that the campaign progression is literally just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whereas from Massive Darkness at least gives you choice, but I think the choice in Oathsworn makes me still feel like I have that sense of agency, and Massive Darkness has the least degree of, how many decisions I'm making as far as how I approach the world around me. And then Tanares has a ton of agency. And so that would be the other con there. Speaking of Tanares, let's go to Tanares. Tanares is a giant game. It's a giant game built off the framework of Arena of the Contest, a game which you have characters who are going to have, you're going to have 8 different classes of characters, I think it's 8 if I'm not mistaken, and those classes all have a degree of the specific characters you're going to use within that class, all of which have their own cards as well, and you're going to be approaching this giant world, the Tanares Adventures universe, in which you have these Kemet that have taken over the world around you, and it's your job to fight back against them across a branching campaign that's going to throw you into story-based text and story-based decisions that will use your characters and modifications along the way until you eventually dive into the scenario. You go into the scenario and you fight off in this giant map against, ton of walls set up and different scenario set up as far as the actual board, and then deal with the various enemies with whatever adjustments the scenarios have thrown at you as you go through it. You're going to be rolling handfuls of d20 again and again and again as you cycle through your cards, and then in between missions you're going to be going to a city phase where you would level up your characters, level up the various base and the blacksmith and the, I can't remember the names of the various places you have, but the various locations that will give you access to stronger powers and better trade-ins while you try to build up your ally deck as well, which is an important part of your currency, as you need to use them to manage everything, to manage your resources, to manage the world phases. You try to take things over in the world phase. There's a ton of city and world phases going on within the game that keep it interesting as you go through a 22 mission arc where you have the missions and then the city world phase, mission, city world phase again and again and again until you eventually achieve the end of it. And along the way there's 100 scenarios to go through, and you're only going to engage with 22 of those, giving you a ton of replay value, which is a good time to start off on the pros of this game. Which the biggest one is, I think this has the strongest degree of how much the world possibly has versus how much you'll engage in it on a single play. You'll engage in 22 missions, then plus the city phase and the world phase. There's going to be a lot of gameplay here. I guesstimate somewhere in the range of 60 to 80 hours to go through a campaign, but within that, you're only seeing a small taste of what the game actually has to offer. It has the highest replayability, in my opinion, in terms of being able to dive back in and play completely different scenarios as you go through it in an incredibly rewarding way. I think it has a ton of that just variability to the experience. You're also going to be comboing powers left, right, and center. Again, I would say Isofarian Guard does it really well, but Tanares Adventures does it just as well, and it does so with the extra enhancement of being on a grid as you go through it. You're going to be using the characters to help each other the entire time as you take actions, as you push an enemy here, as you move an enemy there, as you shove them into the lava, as you pull them back into the spikes, as you try to set up the board around you. And speaking of setting up the board around you, it has a large degree of controlling the enemy AI in a way that no other system here has. The enemy AIs follow specific procedural paths, and you can predict those out, and that does leave a lot of chess-like gameplay as you analyze the board state, you analyze the enemies, and you look here and you're like, well, if I move here, then you'll have to attack that enemy, and you'll walk past me over there, and you'll get residual damage that way. You're also going to walk through the lava because now that's the quickest pathway to get there, and so I can, through min-maxing the enemy AI and the systems at play, I can both attack you and also get an extra 8 damage against you, which is important because these enemies have 70 health on them. These enemies are impactful, they matter, and they are hard to take out as you go through it, and the combination of the powers you're using of the characters you have in play and controlling the enemy AI just gives you a strong degree of control over the scenarios. Control that is then thrown off as you roll handfuls of dice, and the rolling handfuls of dice is still fun. Most of the time you're going to hit, but the loss ratio is high enough on those dice that you will miss enough times that it's still a gamble every single time you roll those dice trying to hit everything. It has an incredibly satisfying city and world phase. There's a lot of fun building up the things you need there. It is both easy enough that it's a fairly quick process. It's a very quick in-between, but it's a satisfying in-between as you draw cards from your ally deck. You have to choose how to manage your resources, managing your ally decks, gathering new equipment for your heroes, and leveling up your buildings, each of which is important, and any one of which, if you neglect, you have a problem, but if you can't do everything, so you have to neglect something as you go through it. It's just an incredibly tight game design. Branching story paths, like I said already, a huge amount of branching. Forget the fact that you only engage with 22 missions and whatnot, but as you go through the story, you're making choices. Do you sneak into the boat, or do you follow the pirates to the meeting? Do you betray your allied captain and back somebody else in a little political skirmish, or do you help them out? And all those change just the story around you and the ways you engage with things and the missions you go on. It's a ton of fun, a ton of depth, a ton of variability, and it just has that rolling handfuls of dice that Massive Noctis has, but in a much more stronger immersive campaign. The flip side is it's ridiculously easy to miss stuff. More so than any game on the table, when you play through Tanares, you will miss things. I guarantee it. It's nearly impossible to get every single thing. There's so many modifiers and rules and things in place. The way the enemy reacts, will they do their special ability? There's a million little things going on that you will miss things as you go through the game. You'll miss them. You just will. I don't see a way around it. You're going to miss stuff in this game, which is okay. It doesn't detract from the experience, but if you're concerned about stuff like that, this is not a game for you. They also have a system where you're flipping from book to book in a way that is kind of obnoxious. You'll have 3 different books set up. You'll have the rule book, the set of cards. You're going to have the scenario book. There's literally 3 different books, not even the rule book. There's 3 books in addition to the rule book. And even within that book, you're flipping through different sections of the book in a way that just the amount of table space you need, not just for the game, but for the books you're going to be constantly flipping through as you go on different quests and set things up and reference different things. They have way too much going on. A thing that they are aware of, and they're fixing it in their reprint campaign that's going on Kickstarter. They're fixing that aspect by taking various quests and batching them into individualized books, because they couldn't put it into one book. It would be a 600-page book. As it is, the 300-page book that they do have is obnoxious enough. And so they are addressing that, but right now, flipping the book to book is a pain. I'll also say that the characters lack distinction as you level up, which is a big con for me. As you go through the game, when you're playing Isofarian, those characters feel like those characters. When you're playing Frosthaven, those characters feel like those characters. Hellscape, Oathsworn, they all feel like those characters. And when you play Tanares Adventures, the classes feel strongly different, but as you level up a character, more and more you start using aspects from their class. And the nature of the Kemet Hunt system means that if you're doing well, you're also going to give up one of your ultimate abilities. And so the way the game design is currently structured, and there are house rules around this, again, if you want to engage with those, but the way the game design is currently structured, by the time you get to a few, like, I don't know, by the time you're done with the first week in the game, and the first week is only, again, a quarter of the game, by the time you're 25% of the way through the game, your characters will mostly feel like their class more so than their character. And the fact that you have 50 characters, which sounds so cool, really comes down to, hey, you have 8 classes, and then like the small little things that make the character feel different. They'll feel different starting off, but as the game progresses, your class levels up more than your character, which does give you, it forces you down a rabbit hole of choosing the class over the character, such that the characters lose the distinction as the game goes on. Now again, it still leaves you with 8 highly asymmetric classes, plus like an extra ability that the character will provide. Which brings us to Oathsworn, the last game on the table. Oathsworn is a boss hunting game that has a campaign, has a story. Every single arc of Oathsworn is going to have a story phase where you make decisions, you choose different things, they'll have consequences as you go through them, you'll lose a little health here, you'll find an item here, you'll make choices that will lead you down certain rabbit holes. And then it all culminates into the actual scenario you go down. The scenario is going to involve you fighting off against a boss. Incredibly highly asymmetric bosses, every single scenario being strikingly different as you go through the game. Every single scenario is strikingly different. I don't even say it, but Tanares has strongly asymmetric scenarios as well. Across those 100 or so scenarios, I have not played 100 scenarios, but from the 10 to 12 scenarios I've played in the game, each one feels strongly different in terms, it's different, I'm not going to say strongly different, each one feels noticeably different in terms of the way you approach it, but Oathsworn puts that to shame with some of the most asymmetric actual scenarios you're going on, with each of the 20 scenarios being vastly different in the way you approach it, the boss you're fighting against, and the complete differences the game brings to the table. It is the most variability, not to the pathways you can choose, but to the way each individual scenario will take you down there. It has a medium-length campaign, meaning past Tanares Adventures, I think, past Massive Darkness, I think Oathsworn is the most accessible if you're looking for something that will give you, 30 to 40 hours of gameplay, but not give you 60 or 100 or 300 hours of gameplay. Those are loose numbers. It's going to depend on what you do and how you engage with things, but I think Oathsworn is the most accessible, coming in at probably 30 to 40 hours of campaign play as you go through it, and making it the second most accessible after Massive Darkness, which is good. If you're looking for something stronger than Massive Darkness, but not so overwhelming as these, Oathsworn will have you over there. The push your luck combat system I adore in the game. You have this idea as you go through the game, where when you go through the game, what you're going to be doing is you're going to you can make choices where effectively you can always roll more dice or draw more cards. The problem is the number of misses you have will define whether the entire attack fails, which means there's never a limit to how high you can aim for, but there is a limit to how likely that will be. But if you're in a tight spot and you need to do 8 damage, sometimes you take a big swing and sometimes you'll miss, but other times you'll hit, and that push your luck system is incredibly rewarding to go through. And there's great class diversity along the way as well, along with possibly, again, second best story. I'll say arguably the best story and the second most immersive story behind Isofarian Guard, giving you a ton of strongly asymmetric scenarios, strongly asymmetric characters, a great companion system. This is another thing to note. They have a great companion system if you're playing the game with fewer than 4 characters, because you always have 4 characters in play. But that does mean that when you're playing the game with fewer than 4 characters, you can either fully control, if you're playing a single player game, I can fully control 4 players, or I can fully control, let's say, 2 characters and have 2 companion characters that have the strength of a full character but a much more simplified system, giving you great ways to play this game at a variety of player counts and letting you choose how complicated that is. It's worth noting Tanares has the same system as well. I think Oathsworn does it better as far as just how well that system is done. Overall, it is engaging as one of the best stories, and it's a very, very, very solid game. The cons for Oathsworn is, first of all, is that you have a choice when you get the game. You can either get the standee version, which is already going to be a giant box, just a single giant box standee version, or you can have 4 giant boxes full of game content in order to have the miniature version with the scenario pack with whatever it is, and 4 giant boxes that there's no easy way to condense everything. You can condense things, but there's no simple, easy way to condense things, especially because of the secretive nature of the way you store all the allies and enemies and bosses and all of that. And so it's just, you have a choice of dialing down how deluxeified the game seems to appear, or just how much table space or shelf space or everything this game is going to set up, and how easy it is. This is not a game you simply pull 4 giant boxes and a wheelbarrow up to Joe's house to go ahead and sit down and play it. There's a lot going on as far as that, and all these games have a lot of content. But Oathsworn is the most binary in how much of a choice there is between something accessible versus something that's really far, far from accessible. I'll say that the combat card cycling system they have isn't as rewarding as I'd like. Oathsworn falls into a weird middle line where I like the dice rolling of Tanares. I like that. I enjoy the dice rolling of Massive Darkness. Those both give me the joy of rolling handfuls of dice, better or for worse. They're just fun to go through that system. Sometimes it's just fun to roll dice and use powers and abilities. And then we have something as tight as Frosthaven, which is an incredibly tight design and just min-maxing your card play in a way that is incredibly satisfying in combat. An Isofarian Guard has a little bit of both in terms of the bag building, has definitely a degree of luck, but incredibly satisfying combo building as you go through it, and Oathsworn to me is good, but it's the least satisfying combat mechanic from these. Again, it's not satisfying, it's just the least satisfying from 5 great systems on the table, at least for myself. I find the card combat cycling has the mental energy of Gloomhaven without feeling, or Frosthaven, without feeling quite as rewarding. It's good, it's just not as good as everything else here. I'll say that some story elements feel on rails. As much as you have the story elements giving you a large degree of choice, and I can't speak for every story element in the game, but there are certainly times in the game where it feels like you're on rails, where it feels like you can choose kind of, but ultimately they're all going to lead back to the same place. And again, I'm not going to say all because I don't know, I have not gone through the whole entire thing, but I will say that there have been certainly times where I checked different story paths and I was like, oh, it doesn't really matter if I choose this or this. They give me a thematic flavor of what conversations I had along the way, but it's going to end up in the exact same point, which when you figure that out, when you see that happening, it takes a little bit of the gravitas out of how much agency you feel. A game that gives you a ton of feeling of agency in the story, but then it ties you back into the same place. And again, you're going through that same arc for the most part, and so there's definitely, as good as the story is, there is that slight lack of feeling once you realize that the story has elements of the story that are very much on rails. These are these 5 game systems. They all offer pros and cons. I've gone through them all extensively. It's a longer video than I expected, which is usually the case over here. I'll say that on a high level, the most accessible, before I get into my own ratings, on a high level, the most accessible game on this table, if you're looking for the easiest game to set up and table and play, the easiest one to table, this, both in terms of rules, in terms of complexity, in terms of management, and just something you're going to play, Massive Darkness is likely right for you. If you're looking for the most immersive story, the most immersive story on the table that's going to give you the best possible engaging story from anything here, if you're here for that, I highly recommend the Isofarian Guard, and I highly recommend using the Foreteller app, specifically with some nice speakers set up. Don't do it on your phone. To get a nice little boombox, I highly recommend the JBL Flip, $35 on Amazon. I highly recommend. I'll be doing a separate video talking about that. But either way, I think it's not sponsored or anything. I love my JBL Flip, and I think it's great at providing a lot of sound in a small space. But if you're looking for the best overall story, the Isofarian Guard is going to be your pick. If you're looking for the most rewarding mechanical system, the one that rewards you for playing well and plays the entire thing on a dime, I think Frosthaven is that game. It is that game that rests so well on the edge of a dime, I guess. That rests so well. It rests so well as far as how tactically sound the game is. I think Frosthaven will give you that experience. If you're looking for the most, almost the most fun in terms of the powers and abilities and the tactical maneuverability with just a ton of agency, choose your own adventure, and just I think fun. Powers and abilities with rolling dice and comboing your characters together, Tanares Adventures has that down in spades. And if you're looking for something that almost combines the best of all of them together, that's probably Oathsworn. Coming in at the second most reasonable in terms of time frame, coming in at the second best story, an incredible system with tons of variety of characters. All in all, I think Oathsworn is the kind of jack of all trades. I hate saying Master of None, but I guess for me on the table, it is Master of None. I don't think Oathsworn is the best at any one element. I think it is the best when you take it all together. That would be my recommendations for you. As far as my system, ranking from my least favorite to most favorite, Isofarian Guard is my least favorite one on the table. It's not a bad game. It's an amazing game. It's an incredible system, and I love it. I think that the replayability aspects and the potential grind of a 300-hour campaign, as much as I enjoy the story, it is a game that I sit down knowing that I'm in for a different kind of experience. I'm here more for the mood and the atmosphere, and I will get incredible combo building, but sometimes the thing that intersperses and breaks that up is story, as opposed to changing up my character or having a different scenario to go down. The combat cycle can be the most repetitive, which is why it's my number 5 here, despite being incredibly good and a game I highly recommend. My number 4 here is Frosthaven, and I want to say this with a grain of salt. I've played through 150 hours of Gloomhaven this past year, which means I am somewhat burnt on the system. Not not burnt. I still play and I still enjoy it, but the level to which the system is fresh to me has gone down. So take into account, when I say Frosthaven is my number 4, it is with the bias of 150 hours of Gloomhaven behind me this past year, and so I've seen it, I've done it, and yes, there are new things there, but I'm somewhat exhausted on it, but it's still an incredible system that is incredibly rewarding and a lot of fun to go through. My biggest complaint is the time you get stuck on those missions. That's the biggest issue I personally have with it. Yes, setup is a beer, but you know what? It's worth it. But getting stuck on a mission that you have to replay, sometimes I'm just like, can we just please skip it? I'd rather do that. My number 3 on this list is Massive Darkness. It is the most guilty pleasure of the group by far, but it is a ton of fun, and the characters, especially for the expansions, I have all the expansions, the characters give you a ton of variability to the asymmetric ways the characters can approach it. And similar to Tanares, there's also other characters on top of the classes, and the classes are totally asymmetric, but the characters have like an extra ability on top of that, not a ton of differences past that. But it's still just easy to dive into, it's easy to play, it's the easiest to set up, it's the easiest to tear down, it's the easiest to go through, it's the easiest to finish a campaign, it's the easiest in all categories, and there's something to be said for a game that is accessible, and for me, that's my number 3. My number 2 is Oathsworn. I think Oathsworn is phenomenal. I think it's incredible. And it's not that I'm willing to say any one of these games is better than the others. Right now is just my personal choice where I am right now, and Oathsworn right now, again, and part of the caveat is, I have 150 hours of Frosthaven, of Gloomhaven under my belt. If I had 150 hours of Oathsworn under my belt, I might answer this differently, so take that into account as I go through this. But I love Oathsworn. It is incredibly, the whole concept of the jack of all trades, master of none, it sounds like a ding, but really, Oathsworn is very, very good. It combines a lot of elements here on the table that make it just so ridiculously good to go through. So satisfying, so variable. The biggest thing I have against it is the combat is the least satisfying from all of these over here, and to me that is a big deal. Although you could make a rival comparison to Isofarian Guard, because Isofarian Guard has more satisfying combats, but then they quickly become less satisfying through repetitiveness, and Oathsworn doesn't have that same level of repetitiveness. I think a map really allows you to break things up strongly. And then obviously that leaves my number 1, which is Tanares Adventures. Tanares Adventures to me is the number 1 pick over here, just because of how well I love playing through the game. I love playing through the game to the point that I play it mostly solo. I've played it on multiple player accounts. I've played it with the companions, but I mostly engage with the game as a full-on solo experience, controlling all 4 characters. I enjoy it that much. I want to manage and mitigate every single aspect of powers and abilities on the characters as I try to figure out exactly how to take down the enemies and the challenges. Every single scenario is hard, and it's powerful, and it's brutally punishing, and you feel like you're going to possibly lose that boss who walks in at the end with 170 health while your characters are down to 20, 30, and whatever, and trying to figure out how are we ultimately going to survive this. And it's not actually that difficult, because they have a system in play where you're allowed free characters' deaths and first aid kits. They have that system in play, but if you do that, you lose the Kemet Hunt status. And so if you're trying to actually win with the ideal way, with there's no character deaths and no resets and all of that, then it's challenging, and it feels challenging. And I've so far been able to do it, but every single scenario has both been a game that I've won, but also a game that I felt like I was this close to losing as I min-max every single opportunity on the table. The enemy AI, my own powers, using my ultimate at the right moment. There's so much fun to the system, and I personally like a game that I always win. I like it. My thing is not about winning or losing. My thing is that I want to feel like I overcame a challenge and a difficulty, and when I play Tanares every single game, I felt like I overcame a challenge and a difficulty as I roll dice, as I try to deal 27 damage in a single shot while healing 2 allies, because the ultimates in the game are so ridiculously cool. I love Tanares Adventures, and the combination of replayability, the variability, the scenario variability, the class and character variability, every single aspect to me ultimately makes it my number 1 pick from all these 5 games. And that's your Dungeon Crawler Epic Campaign Game Show-Off. That's a whole pro-con for each of these, my own personal rankings, what the high level I think for you is. Let me know down below which one of these is your favorite if you've played them, and or alternatively which one I'm missing. There are a bunch of other systems out there. Some of them I just haven't had the time to properly play enough to include on this list. Others are from previous years, and this is more about if you're picking something new right now, what do you want to pick? But all of these are incredible games that I highly recommend. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and I hope you have a good one.